My name is Callie Clark, and I was 42 the winter my family taught me the exact price of their greed. 3 weeks after my grandfather died, my parents stood in his living room and announced he had left his entire $4 million estate to a wildlife charity. They thought I would simply nod and walk away. They were wrong. What they did not know was that the charity was registered to my brother's luxury condo. And what they really did not know was that the forensic auditor assigned to the estate was my own daughter. The day she stood up and presented her findings, my father dropped his crystal champagne flute, and his hands shook so hard he had to grip the table. Welcome back to Aura Vengeance, the channel where quiet people finally stop apologizing and the truth arrives right on time. If your family ever tried to write you out of the story, you are in the right place. Drop a comment telling me your age and where you are listening from, and be sure to subscribe. Now let me take you back to the beginning, to the afternoon of Grandpa Harrison's funeral and the lie that broke my family in two. The reception took place at the main ranch house just outside Bozeman, Montana. The air inside smelled of damp wool coats, catered roast beef, and the lingering scent of wood smoke from the stone fireplace. My job is logistics management for a regional agricultural cooperative. I spend my days tracking missing freight across state lines. When 3 tons of winter wheat vanish from a manifest, I find the gap in the paper trail. To me, missing money is just a different kind of freight. It always leaves a footprint. I stood near the kitchen archway holding a mug of black coffee, watching my parents play their parts. Richard and Barbara moved through the crowd of neighbors and extended family with practiced grace. My mother dabbed the corners of her dry eyes with a tissue every time a guest offered condolences. My father kept his hand placed solemnly over his heart. Across the room, my younger brother Mason leaned against the mahogany bar. He held a glass of bourbon. Mason was a serial entrepreneur whose brilliant ideas routinely ended in quiet bankruptcies. Just 2 months prior, he had called me asking for a loan to cover his truck payment. But as he reached for a napkin, his suit sleeve pulled back. A pristine Rolex Daytona caught the light from the chandelier. The retail price on that watch hovers around $15,000. The heavy silver band gleamed against his wrist. I took a sip of my coffee and filed that detail away. An hour into the gathering, my father tapped a silver spoon against his glass. The sharp ringing cut through the low hum of conversation. The room quieted. "I want to thank you all for coming today to honor Dad," Richard said. His voice carried a thick, rehearsed sorrow. Dad loved this land. He loved Montana, and in his final weeks he made a decision about his legacy. He wanted to give back to the wilderness that gave him so much. He amended his will and left the ranch, along with his liquid assets, to a conservation fund, the Big Sky Heritage Foundation. My mother let out a soft, timed sigh, leaning her head against my father's shoulder. A ripple of impressed murmurs washed over the guests. My grip tightened on my coffee mug. The ceramic dug into my palm. Grandpa Harrison despised charities. He believed in sweat equity, hard work, and keeping the land in the family. More importantly, he had walked the lower pastures with me just 4 weeks before his final stroke. He had pointed out the rotting fence lines near the creek, telling me exactly which posts he expected me to replace when the deed transferred to my name. He had never mentioned a foundation. He had never mentioned giving away the soil we grew up on. I waited until the guests began filtering toward the buffet. I walked over to where my parents stood near the hallway. I kept my voice low, polite, and even. "Dad," I said, "I would like to see the estate documents, just to understand how the transfer to this foundation is being handled." My father stiffened. His polite smile vanished, replaced by a tight, thin line. Before he could speak, my mother stepped between us. She leaned in close, ensuring the nearby guests could not hear her. Her voice was a venomous whisper. "Your grandfather is barely in the ground, Callie, and you are already asking for a handout." "I am not asking for a handout, Mom. I am asking to read the amendment." Barbara's eyes narrowed. She looked me up and down, a gaze designed to make me feel 12 years old and foolish. You have always been selfish. Richard has spent the last month dealing with lawyers and hospice nurses, and you want to interrogate him over paperwork? The estate is sealed. The foundation takes everything. It is what Harrison wanted. Do not ruin this day with your greed." She turned her back to me, linking her arm through my father's, and guided him toward the local bank manager standing by the fireplace. I did not follow them. In my line of work, when someone blocks access to a shipping manifest, it means the cargo is dirty. I set my mug on the nearest table. I walked down the hall and slipped into Grandpa Harrison's empty study. The room was cold. It smelled of old paper and pipe tobacco. His heavy oak desk sat perfectly organized, just the way he left it. On the corner of the desk rested his worn leather ledger. He used it every single day. He tracked weather patterns, cattle yields, and in his later years, the severity of his arthritis pain. I ran my fingers over the cracked leather cover. I slipped it into my bag. It was a piece of him, and I was not going to let it get packed into a donation box. I walked out the back door and crossed the gravel driveway to my truck. The Montana winter air bit at my face. I climbed inside, shut the door, and gripped the freezing steering wheel. I did not turn the key. I pulled my phone from my coat pocket. I opened the state registry database for nonprofit organizations. My fingers moved quickly over the screen. I typed in the Big Sky Heritage Foundation. The search icon spun for 2 seconds. The result populated on my screen. The foundation was registered as a tax-exempt charity, but it did not have an office suite in town. It did not have a P.O. box at the local post office. The registered headquarters for the charity that just inherited $4 million was listed as Unit 4B on Main Street. I stared at the glowing screen. The heater in the truck kicked on, blowing warm air over my cold hands. Unit 4B was Mason's luxury condominium. My brother, who could not make his own car payments, was running the foundation. My parents had not given the ranch to charity. They had stolen it. They had funneled generations of equity straight into their own pockets under the guise of philanthropy. I put the truck in gear and drove down the mountain road, the tires crunching over the packed snow. My mind categorized the variables like a freight audit. I had the address. I had the motive. But my parents were careful people. They would never leave loose ends in a legal document. If this charity was a hollow front to rob the family blind, how did they bypass the legal firewall? Grandpa's estate attorney was notoriously strict. He would never let a suspicious amendment pass his desk. How did my parents get a legally binding signature on a document that gave them everything? I spent the next 2 weeks hunting a ghost. The ghost's name was Thomas Davis. Thomas Davis was Grandpa Harrison's estate attorney for 40 years. He was a rigid, humorless man who measured his words carefully and never took legal shortcuts. If my parents had successfully diverted a $4 million estate, Davis was the formidable gatekeeper they had to bypass. Or, as my mother had so casually planted in my ear during the funeral reception, he was the architect. I remembered Barbara whispering to a distant cousin by the buffet line that afternoon. She claimed Davis had structured the wildlife charity specifically to shield the ranch from crippling estate taxes. It sounded highly plausible. Wealthy families use foundations as tax shelters regularly. I assumed Davis took a handsome cut of the estate to draft the airtight amendment. I treated him the way I treat a corrupt vendor in my supply chain. My job requires me to verify authorized signers on international freight releases. You learn very quickly that people can fake a corporate stamp, but handwriting holds muscle memory. I needed to see the actual paperwork. I started my audit the way I always do. I isolated my target. I called his downtown law office on a Tuesday morning, posing as a former client needing to retrieve old property records. A recorded voice greeted me, stating the firm had officially dissolved. I sat at my kitchen table, the glow of my laptop screen illuminating the dark room, and began cross-referencing State Bar Association records and real estate tax transfers. Thomas Davis had sold his practice, packed up his historic home, and relocated to a gated retirement community in Naples, Florida. The date on his property transfer caught my attention. He moved exactly 5 weeks before Grandpa died. The timing was too clean. He left the state right before the estate was radically restructured. The narrative my mother was selling did not fit the timeline. A lawyer does not draft a $4 million trust amendment for his oldest client and then abandon his practice the very next month without overseeing the execution. I needed the physical proof. The following Monday, I took a half day off from the logistics cooperative. I drove out to the Gallatin County Courthouse. The building was an imposing stone structure that smelled of industrial floor wax and old radiator heat. I walked up to the probate clerk's window. My pulse maintained a steady, even rhythm. I paid the $20 administrative fee and requested a printed copy of the public probate filing for Harrison Clark. The clerk, a young woman who looked bored out of her mind, clicked her mouse a few times and sent the file to the printer. She handed me a thick stack of stapled paper. I did not read it in the lobby. I walked back out to the parking lot and climbed into my truck. I left the engine off. The cold seeped through the floorboards, chilling my ankles, but I barely felt it. I opened the file. I flipped past the standard death certificate and the initial probate declarations, navigating straight to the final page of the trust amendment. There it was, the specific legal clause diverting every acre, every dollar, and every piece of heavy machinery to the Big Sky Heritage Foundation. Below the text sat the signature of the executing attorney, Thomas Davis. I pulled a secondary folder from my passenger seat. Inside were copies of old agricultural deeds Grandpa had filed a decade ago, all legitimately signed by his lawyer. I placed an old deed next to the new amendment, resting them both against my steering wheel. I traced the ink with the tip of my finger. Davis had a distinct signature. He bore down hard on the first letter of his first name, creating a deep indent in the paper, and his letters leaned sharply to the right. His signature was the mark of a man who wrote fast and with authority. The signature on the new trust amendment was hesitant. The ink pressure was uniform across the entire name, suggesting a slow, deliberate drawing rather than a natural motion. The loops were overly round. The slant was entirely vertical. My logistics brain flagged the discrepancy instantly. Someone had tried to draw his name focusing so hard on getting the shape right that they lost the natural fluidity of the pen stroke. Davis had not signed this document. His signature was clumsily forged. I turned back to the first page of the amendment, checking the date of execution. Then I pulled up the state registry screenshot I had saved on my phone for the charity. The dates locked together, forming a cold, ugly picture. The Big Sky Heritage Foundation was incorporated on a Thursday. The trust amendment, leaving the entire estate to that exact foundation, was signed 3 weeks before Harrison passed. My parents had not outsmarted a brilliant tax lawyer. They had not utilized a clever legal loophole to protect the family wealth. They had waited until Davis retired and left the state. Then they drafted a fake amendment, funneled the assets to a hollow foundation controlled by my brother, and forged the attorney's signature to make it look official to the probate clerk. They had committed felony fraud. I sat in the freezing truck staring at the fabricated paperwork. The reality of their betrayal settled over me. This was not a standard family disagreement over an inheritance. This was a calculated criminal syndicate operating out of my brother's living room. But recognizing a forged slant on a piece of paper in the front seat of a truck is not the same as presenting admissible evidence in a courtroom. A forged signature could be fiercely contested. If I brought this to the local authorities now, my parents would hire expensive defense lawyers using Grandpa's own money. They would claim Davis signed it in a rush or his hand was tired. They would drag the litigation out for years until the foundation accounts were drained dry. To stop them permanently, I needed to see the blood flow of the operation. I needed the banking routing numbers, the deposit slips, the withdrawal timestamps. I needed irrefutable proof that the foundation was actively kicking money into my brother's pockets and funding my parents' lifestyle. There was a formidable barrier standing in my way. Probate financial accounts are sealed to the public. Corporate charity banking is locked behind federal privacy firewalls. I was a complete outsider. I had no legal authority to request those ledgers. My parents held all the keys, and they were guarding that door with their lives. They knew the paper trail was their only vulnerability. How was I going to get inside my parents' airtight financial vault without triggering their alarms? A month after the funeral, the phone rang while I was auditing a delayed rail shipment from North Dakota. The caller ID flashed my mother's name. I let it ring 3 times before picking up. Her tone was brisk and authoritative, the cadence of a woman who expects immediate compliance. She requested my presence at the main ranch house that evening. She framed it as a necessary family meeting to discuss estate logistics. I drove up the mountain road just as the sun dipped behind the Bridger Range, casting long, sharp shadows across the snow. The main house looked exactly as it always had. The porch lights glowed warm against the pine siding. A thick plume of smoke drifted from the chimney. It was the picture of Montana domestic comfort built on a foundation of theft. Richard and Barbara were waiting for me in the living room. My father stood near the hearth, prodding the logs with a wrought iron poker. My mother sat on the edge of the leather sofa, holding a pristine porcelain teacup. The atmosphere in the room felt heavily curated. I took a seat in the armchair opposite her, resting my hands evenly on my lap. I waited for them to open the negotiation. Barbara sighed, setting her teacup down with a delicate clink. The probate process is becoming a nightmare, Callie. She rubbed her temples, mimicking exhaustion. The legal fees are draining our personal accounts. The charity trust cannot release any operating funds until the final court approval clears next quarter. We are struggling just to keep the heat on and the property taxes paid. My father turned away from the fire, nodding in grim agreement. We are doing everything we can. Your brother is barely holding himself together. Mason actually left the state last week. He is volunteering down south just to process his grief away from the memories here. I kept my facial expression entirely neutral. Mason volunteering was a concept so foreign to reality, it belonged in a science fiction novel. But I cataloged the detail. He was out of the state, and my parents were claiming poverty. I let the silence stretch, forcing them to fill the void. Richard stepped forward, his boots heavy on the hardwood floor. He pulled a sheaf of stapled documents from his back pocket and placed them on the coffee table between us. "We need to bridge the gap until the trust clears," he said, his voice dropping into a register of parental confidence. "We went to the bank this morning. We can secure a short-term equity line, $100,000. It will cover the ranch taxes and keep the family afloat. But because our assets are temporarily tied up in the estate transition, the bank requires a secondary guarantor." My mother leaned forward, offering a warm, fragile smile. "We just need you to co-sign the loan, honey. You can use your house in town as collateral. It is a mere formality. Grandpa would want us to pull together right now to protect the land." I looked down at the paperwork. They were asking me to leverage the only asset I owned, my modest 3-bedroom home, to fund their lifestyle. They had stolen a $4 million estate, forged a legal document, and funneled the wealth into a shadow charity. Now standing in the house they stole, they wanted me to risk my own financial security to cover their immediate cash flow problems. The audacity was breathtaking. I did not raise my voice. I did not point out the forged signature I had discovered at the courthouse. I did not ask about my brother's phantom volunteer work. In my profession, you learn that anger makes you predictable. Silence makes you dangerous. I looked up from the paperwork and met my father's gaze. "I cannot do that, Dad. My finances are too tight right now to take on collateral risk." The curated warmth in the room vanished instantly. The sudden shift in air pressure was palpable. My father's jaw tightened. He snatched the paperwork off the table. "I am not asking for a handout, Callie. I am asking you to be a part of this family." Barbara stood up. The porcelain teacup rattled in its saucer. "You have always been like this." She crossed her arms, her voice rising, shedding the fragile widow routine. "Whenever anyone asks you for the simplest favor, you build a wall. Your grandfather is barely gone, and you refuse to help save his property. You are so fiercely selfish. You always have been. You sit in town counting your little paychecks while Richard bears the burden of this entire estate." It was the exact emotional manipulation tactic she had deployed my entire childhood. She would demand an unreasonable sacrifice, and when I hesitated, she would attack my character, isolating me, making me feel small, ungrateful, and crazy. For years, that tactic worked. I would fold, apologize, and do whatever she asked just to restore the peace. They expected the silence to break me. They mistook my stoicism for the old, familiar compliance. They were waiting for me to pick up the pen. I stood up from the armchair. I buttoned my coat. I will let myself out. I walked out the front door, leaving my mother shouting about my lack of loyalty, echoing in the hallway. I drove back down the mountain, my hands steady on the steering wheel. They were desperate for liquid cash. The foundation money was locked in a holding pattern, and their greed was outpacing their patience. When I arrived back at my house, I walked straight into my home office. The room was dark, illuminated only by the glow of the street lamp outside the window. I reached into my work bag and pulled out Grandpa Harrison's worn leather ledger. I had taken it from his study the day of the funeral, intending to keep it as a sentimental reminder of the man who taught me how to read weather fronts. I sat at my desk and opened the heavy cover. Grandpa was a meticulous record keeper. Every page was dated. Every entry detailed the daily operations of the ranch, the barometric pressure, and in a secondary column, the state of his physical health. He suffered from severe rheumatoid arthritis. Some days were manageable. Other days, his joints locked up entirely. I flipped through the pages, navigating toward the final months of his life. I stopped on the Tuesday in late October, the exact date printed on the fraudulent trust amendment. The day my parents claimed he sat down with a notary and signed away his legacy. I stared at the page. The handwriting was not his usual precise script. It was a jagged, barely legible scrawl that dragged across the lines. I leaned closer, deciphering the words etched in blue ink. Cold front moved in, hands completely numb, joints locked. Cannot hold a pen to sign the feed checks, had the foreman stamp them. The breath caught in my throat. I ran my finger over the erratic ink. He was physically paralyzed that week. His hands were useless. He had to rely on his ranch foreman just to pay the grain suppliers. He could not have signed a complex legal document. The signature on the amendment was not just a clumsy forgery mimicking his lawyer. It was attached to a date when the man himself was medically incapacitated. The narrative my parents constructed was structurally unsound at its very foundation. But a glaring discrepancy in an old ledger presented a new, terrifying problem. A forged signature is one element of a crime. A legal trust amendment, however, requires an authorized witness. It requires a state-sanctioned professional to verify identity and witness the physical act of signing. I pulled the copy of the trust amendment from my desk drawer. I flipped past the forged lawyer signature and the date. I looked at the bottom corner of the final page. There, stamped in bold black ink, was the official state seal. If Grandpa was physically incapable of holding a pen, whose official notary stamp validated the fake document and made it legally binding in the eyes of the court, to dismantle a fraudulent supply chain, you do not attack the cargo first. You attack the shipping manifesto. The paperwork is where the thieves invariably stumble. They create a facade that looks robust from a distance, but the structural integrity always fails under microscopic pressure. I knew my parents forged the trust amendment. I knew Grandpa Harrison could not hold a pen on the date the document was executed. But attacking the will directly through probate court would trigger a brutal, protracted legal war. My parents would drain the estate, paying defense attorneys to argue over handwriting analysis and medical records. I needed a cleaner angle of attack. I shifted my focus away from the forged amendment and zeroed in on the entity receiving the stolen assets, the Big Sky Heritage Foundation. To operate a legitimate 501c3 nonprofit organization in the United States, federal law requires a specific corporate structure. You cannot simply incorporate a charity and hand control to a single family member. The Internal Revenue Service mandates an independent board of directors to provide oversight and prevent self-dealing. I sat at my kitchen table, the blue light of my laptop reflecting off the dark window panes. I pulled the public tax filings for the foundation. The The documents were readily available through the state registry. I scrolled past the mission statement, which was a generic paragraph about preserving Montana wildlife, and navigated to the organizational hierarchy. My brother Mason Clark was listed as the executive director and treasurer. His luxury condo address was listed as the corporate headquarters. Below his name sat the required independent board of directors. There were 2 names listed, Sarah Jenkins and David Vance. I stared at the screen, the cursor blinking steadily. The audacity of their lie was staggering. I recognized both names instantly. David Vance was Mason's college roommate. They had lived together in a decrepit apartment near the university a decade ago. But David had not lived in Montana or even the United States for 10 years. He had moved to Germany right after graduation to work for an automotive engineering firm. He had no ties to local conservation efforts and certainly no legal capacity to oversee a $4 million estate transfer from another continent. Mason had simply borrowed a familiar name to fill a blank line on a state form. The second name was far worse. Sarah Jenkins was my mother's older sister, my Aunt Sarah. Aunt Sarah was 78 years old. She resided in a specialized memory care facility in Billings, Montana. She suffered from advanced late-stage dementia. The disease had eroded her cognitive function so severely she no longer recognized her own children, let alone understood the fiduciary responsibilities of managing a multi-million-dollar charitable trust. My parents had not merely forged a signature to steal the ranch. They had fabricated an entire board of directors to launder the stolen millions, exploiting a dementia patient and an expatriate to create a phantom oversight committee. This was no longer a domestic dispute over inheritance. This was systemic corporate fraud. In my logistics career, when I suspect a vendor is falsifying shipment records, I do not call and accuse them. I gather the physical proof required to terminate the contract. I treated my family with the exact same professional detachment. The following morning, I took another personal day from the cooperative. I drove the 2 hours east to Billings. The highway stretched out like a gray ribbon cutting through the snow-covered plains. The sky was a pale, flat white, threatening a late winter storm. I arrived at the Whispering Pines Care Center just before noon. The facility was clean, but institutional smelling, faintly of bleach and overcooked vegetables. I signed the visitor log at the front desk and walked down the quiet, carpeted hallway to Aunt Sarah's room. She sat in a reclining chair near the window, staring blankly at a television playing a muted game show. Her hands rested limply in her lap. I sat beside her for 20 minutes holding her fragile hand. She did not look away from the screen. She did not know who I was. I left her room and walked straight to the administrative office. I asked to speak with the facility director, a pragmatic woman named Helen. I sat across from her heavy mahogany desk. I explained that I was updating family legal records and required a formal status update on my aunt's cognitive health. I kept my tone clinical, betraying no internal panic or anger. Helen pulled Sarah's medical file. She confirmed what I already knew. Sarah Jenkins had been a resident in the memory care unit for 4 years. Her cognitive decline was absolute. I need a formal statement, I said evenly. An affidavit confirming her admission date and a medical assessment stating she lacks the mental capacity to comprehend, review, or sign any legally binding financial documents. Helen looked at me carefully, her administrative instincts sensing a legal conflict brewing just out of sight. I can provide a standardized letter of medical incapacity based on her attending physician's notes, she said, but I cannot offer legal testimony. A standard letter of incapacity notarized by your front desk staff will be sufficient, I replied. I waited in the lobby for 40 minutes. When I walked out the sliding glass doors of the care center, I carried a sealed envelope containing a sworn, notarized affidavit proving the Big Sky Heritage Foundation was operating under a fraudulent board. The state and federal tax filings my brother submitted were built on a verifiable lie. I walked across the icy parking lot to my truck. I unlocked the door and climbed into the driver's seat. Before I put the keys in the ignition, my phone vibrated in my coat pocket. It was a voicemail notification. The caller ID showed Mason's number. I pressed play, listening through the truck's Bluetooth speakers. "Callie it is, Mason." The golden boy's voice filled the cab. He sounded strained, the forced, casual tone slipping slightly at the edges. "Mom mentioned you were asking a lot of questions about the estate documents. You need to let this go. The ranch is gone. The charity is handling everything now. You poking around the probate files is really upsetting Mom, and it is disrespectful to Grandpa's memory. Just stop sniffing around the estate. Do not make this harder than it has to be." The line clicked dead. He was not calling out of grief. He was calling out of fear. My mother had clearly panicked after I refused to co-sign the equity loan and told him I was asking to read the amendment. They knew the paperwork was sloppy. They knew I possessed the professional skills to dismantle a falsified ledger. I saved the audio file to a secure cloud drive. I added it to the digital folder alongside the photo of the forged amendment, the screenshots of the corporate registry, and the notarized affidavit regarding Aunt Sarah's incapacity. I had successfully mapped the perimeter of their criminal syndicate. I knew they forged the will, exploited a sick relative, and set up a hollow charity to steal the inheritance. But a critical piece of the puzzle was still missing. I had the fraudulent structure, but I did not have the money. I needed to see the internal banking. I needed the deposit slips, the wire transfers, the specific financial transactions proving Mason and my parents were siphoning the stolen funds into their personal accounts. Without the banking records, they could claim the charity was merely disorganized. With the banking records, they were going to federal prison. But those records were locked behind corporate bank firewalls. As an outsider, I possessed zero legal authority to request a financial audit of a private foundation. With my family actively monitoring my movements and aggressively covering their tracks, how could I penetrate their airtight financial vault and secure the definitive banking proof before they spent the entire estate? Every impenetrable vault has a back door. You just have to know who is holding the key. My parents believed they had constructed a flawless financial fortress. They forged the legal documents, installed a phantom board of directors, and locked the stolen inheritance behind the encrypted walls of corporate banking. They knew I possessed the logistics background to spot a lie on a shipping manifest, but they also knew I lacked the legal subpoena power to compel a bank to release private foundation records. They thought they had successfully boxed me out of the game. This is where their arrogance engineered their absolute ruin. They made a fatal, unrecoverable miscalculation. My daughter, Emma Lawson, is 26 years old. She retained her father's last name after my divorce a decade ago. My family, perpetually self-absorbed and dismissive of anyone operating outside their immediate sphere of influence, rarely paid attention to Emma's career. They knew she lived in Helena, the state capital, and they knew she worked with numbers. They assumed she was a low-level bookkeeper, balancing ledgers for small businesses. Emma is a senior data analyst at one of the most prestigious forensic accounting firms in the Pacific Northwest. Her specialty is reconstructing fractured financial timelines for corporate fraud investigations. When a multi-million-dollar estate transfers assets into a newly formed charitable trust, state probate law often requires a mandatory third-party audit to ensure fiduciary compliance. The court demands an independent review to confirm the assets are secured and properly allocated before releasing the final probate holds. My father, Richard, was desperate to unlock the restricted funds. He needed the probate court to finalize the estate closure so Mason could begin freely moving the millions out of the charity and into their personal accounts. Richard needed an audit firm, and he needed one fast. Thinking he was executing a brilliant tactical maneuver, Richard bypassed the local, slower accounting offices in Bozeman. He drove to Helena and hired Emma's firm. He selected them specifically because their corporate brochure boasted rapid turnaround times for estate valuations. He walked into their lobby, signed a retention contract, and handed over complete unrestricted access to the Big Sky Heritage Foundation's internal banking ledgers. He had absolutely no idea his own estranged granddaughter worked in the building. Emma was not the lead partner on the account. That responsibility fell to her strict, uncompromising mentor, a senior partner named Marcus. Marcus managed the high-profile client interactions and signed off on the final certifications. But the firm's hierarchy dictated that all raw financial data flowing into the office had to be processed, sorted, and cataloged by the back-end analytics team before hitting the senior partner's desk. Emma was the lead back-end analyst. My phone rang at 11:30 on a Thursday night. I was sitting at my kitchen table reviewing a delayed freight route, my mind cycling through the dead ends of my investigation. I answered the call. "Mom," Emma said. Her voice was uncharacteristically tight, a low, urgent whisper bleeding through the speaker. "Are you alone?" "Yes," I replied, setting my pen down. "What is wrong?" Emma took a sharp breath. "The firm just acquired a new priority client this afternoon, a rush job for an estate closure down in Gallatin County. Marcus assigned me to prep the raw data intakes." She paused. The silence on the line stretched tight. "I am looking at the internal banking files for the Big Sky Heritage Foundation," she said. "I am looking at Grandpa Harrison's estate." The air in my kitchen went entirely still. The sheer, staggering improbability of the moment locked my muscles in place. My father had hand-delivered the exact financial records I needed directly to the one person on earth who knew how to read them against his lies. "Are you absolutely certain?" I asked, my voice dropping to a measured calm. "I am staring at the wire transfer routing numbers right now, Mom. It is a complete data dump. Checking accounts, investment portfolios, the trust, disbursements, all of it. Marcus wants the preliminary mapping done by Tuesday." The scale of the dramatic irony was breathtaking. My parents were sitting in the ranch house they stole, completely confident their secrets were safe behind a wall of expensive accountants, while my daughter sat in a cubicle 2 hours away, holding the master key to their destruction. "Does Marcus know about the family connection?" I asked. "No," Emma replied quickly. "My last name is Lawson. The estate is filed under Clark. To Marcus, this is just another wealthy rancher transferring assets. He has no idea I am related to the deceased or the client." If Emma disclosed the familial conflict of interest, ethical guidelines would require Marcus to immediately pull her off the account. The files would be reassigned to a different analyst, a stranger who did not know Aunt Sarah was in memory care, a stranger who did not know Thomas Davis moved to Florida, a stranger who would likely rubber stamp the messy paperwork just to meet the rush deadline Richard demanded. We would lose our only window into the vault. "Emma, listen to me very carefully," I said, leaning forward over my desk. "Do not say a single word to Marcus. Do not flag the conflict of interest." "But Mom, if I touch this data and they find out later, it violates firm policy. I could lose my job." "You are not going to alter the data," I told her. "You are going to do exactly what Marcus pays you to do. You are going to map the financial timeline with perfect, ruthless accuracy. You process the intake just like any other client, but you send me the anomalies." I outlined the parameters of our new reality. My family had constructed a fraudulent charity based on a forged legal document. Now they were arrogant enough to submit those fabricated records to a premier auditing firm, expecting a rapid certification to unlock the stolen millions. "Let them build the whole house before we burn it down," I said. If we confronted them now with a few suspicious wire transfers, they would scramble. They would hire defense lawyers, claim bookkeeping errors, and hide behind the complexity of the trust transition. They would drag the fight into civil court and exhaust the estate funds fighting me. I wanted them to commit to the lie on the official record. I wanted my father to stand before the state of Montana, present the fraudulent audit data, and legally declare it accurate. Once he formally submitted the forged timeline to the probate judge, the trap would permanently snap shut. It would elevate the crime from a civil inheritance dispute to federal wire fraud. Emma agreed. She stayed at her office late into the night, mapping the financial architecture of the Big Sky Heritage Foundation. She operated as a ghost inside their machine. For the next 4 days, my phone buzzed with encrypted text messages from Helena. Emma fed me the raw intelligence my parents fought so hard to conceal. I sat at my kitchen table, cross-referencing her data against the public records I had gathered. The picture that emerged was not just theft. It was a chaotic, desperate looting spree. My parents were draining the estate with reckless speed. They were funneling cash out of the charity under the guise of administrative expenses, transferring thousands of dollars into private accounts controlled by my brother. But their aggressive spending created a new vulnerability. The raw bank files Emma was processing were a disaster. The ledgers were riddled with glaring inconsistencies, missing receipts, and highly suspicious outbound wire transfers. Even a junior accountant would flag the chaotic spending patterns. Marcus, a veteran forensic partner, would undoubtedly halt the audit and demand a rigorous explanation for the missing funds before he ever signed a certification letter. My father was not a patient man, and he was not accustomed to being told no. He needed the audit certified immediately to satisfy the probate court. When Marcus inevitably raised questions about the chaotic ledgers and the missing thousands, what desperate lengths would my father go to in order to ensure the prestigious accounting firm rubber-stamped his forged documents and finalized the theft? Men like my father operate on a timeline dictated by their own hubris. He was a man accustomed to the small-town deference of Bozeman, where his last name commanded a certain level of unearned respect. He bullied contractors, intimidated local bank managers, and expected the world to bend to his schedule. When he hired the prestigious accounting firm in Helena, he expected the same localized submission. He assumed his wealth would smooth over any rough edges in the paperwork. He did not account for the cold, methodical friction of corporate compliance. By Wednesday afternoon, that friction sparked into a fire. Emma sent me a secure message from her terminal. She had finished mapping the first quarter statements for the Big Sky Heritage Foundation. The numbers were not just chaotic, they were a hemorrhage. My brother was bleeding the charity dry through a series of rapid outbound wire transfers. Emma categorized them in her spreadsheet. The outflows were labeled under the vague, ambiguous umbrella of administrative grants. They were staggering sums of money: $12,000 on a Tuesday, $18,000 the following Monday. They bypassed the standard vendor payment systems entirely and routed directly into a secondary checking account controlled by Mason. In the logistics industry, vague billing categories are an immediate red flag for ghost shipments. You do not pay a vendor invoice for miscellaneous transit. You pay for diesel fuel, highway mileage, and driver hours. My brother was billing the charity for ghost shipments, and the cash was vanishing into the ether. Emma compiled the data matrix and sent the preliminary findings up the chain of command to Marcus. Marcus was a veteran of forensic accounting. He built his lucrative partnership by dismantling corporate embezzlement schemes and tracing offshore accounts. A senior partner of his caliber does not sign a legally binding certification letter for a ledger leaking untraceable cash. He immediately halted the review process. He sent a formal written inquiry to Richard requesting itemized receipts, tax documentation, and project proposals for every single administrative grant. That single email sent a shockwave through the ranch house. My father panicked. He realized the Helena accountants were not rubber stamping the file to meet his deadline. They were actually reading the ledgers. Rather than providing the non-existent receipts, Richard fell back on his primary instinct. He attempted to leverage his way out of the corner. He picked up his phone and called Marcus directly. I read the exact words of that conversation 30 minutes after it ended. Marcus ran a strictly regulated department. To protect the firm from liability and federal oversight, all client calls regarding disputed financial ledgers were routed through a recorded compliance line. The system automatically generated a written transcript. Emma accessed the compliance log, printed the document, and sent me a secure photograph of the pages. I sat at my kitchen table tracing the lines of text with my index finger. The transcript read like a masterclass in desperate manipulation. Richard began with an emotional shield. He leaned heavily on his role as the grieving son. He told Marcus that the probate process was taking a severe toll on the family's mental health. He claimed my mother was struggling to cope with the loss of Grandpa Harrison, and the mounting legal paperwork was pushing her toward a breakdown. "We just need to close this chapter," my father said on the recording. "The endless bureaucracy is keeping the wound open. Barbara cannot sleep. I need this audit finalized so my family can find some peace." He was weaponizing grief to bypass an audit. It was the exact same tactic Barbara had used on me in the living room, trying to shame me into signing the equity loan. Marcus remained impervious to the theatrics. The transcript showed his responses were brief, clinical, and polite. He expressed standard condolences, but reiterated that the regulatory framework required corresponding invoices for the outflows. Without the invoices, the certification remained paused. Sensing the emotional manipulation failing, Richard pivoted. He reached for the only weapon he truly respected. He reached for his wallet. He dressed the bribe up as a strategic business proposition. "Listen to me, Marcus," my father said. "The Big Sky Heritage Foundation is sitting on a $4 million portfolio. Currently, those assets are parked in a low-yield local bank. That is inefficient. If we can expedite this preliminary review, if we can secure the certification by Friday without getting bogged down in administrative minutia, I will transition the entire portfolio to your firm. Your wealth management division can handle the investing." $4 million, Marcus. That generates a very lucrative management fee for your partnership. I lowered the printed page, the paper crisp against my fingertips. My father thought he was operating like a corporate heavyweight. He offered a heavy financial incentive to look the other way. In his mind, every professional had a price, and $4 million was enough to buy a blind eye. He did not realize he was bleeding in the water in front of a predator. Marcus despised unethical leverage. When a client offers a sudden lucrative bonus to ignore a glaring discrepancy, it is the equivalent of a neon sign pointing directly to the fraud. Marcus did not negotiate. He did not politely decline the offer and move on. "I appreciate you clarifying your position, Mr. Clark," Marcus replied smoothly. "We will be in touch regarding the next steps." Marcus terminated the call. The attempt to sabotage the review backfired with spectacular precision. Marcus walked out of his corner office, crossed the floor of the analytics department, and dropped a physical copy of the audio transcript directly onto Emma's keyboard. Marcus did not know Emma was related to the man on the phone. He only knew she was his most meticulous data analyst, the one who caught the bleeding ledger in the first place. "Halt the standard probate certification," Marcus told her. "This is no longer a preliminary review. The client just attempted to bribe a senior partner to bypass missing funds. Elevate this account to a high-priority internal fraud investigation. I want every deleted metadata file, every canceled check, and every wire routing number scrubbed and verified. Leave no stone unturned." Emma nodded, her expression perfectly neutral, while her pulse hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. By trying to buy his way out of a standard inquiry, my father handed my daughter the keys to his entire kingdom. Emma was no longer just mapping a timeline. She was firmly in the driver's seat of a sanctioned fraud collection. She had the full weight and authority of the firm backing her deep dive into the charity's architecture. The financial front was now perfectly secured. The banking evidence would be cataloged, preserved, and legally documented by an independent agency. The money trail was a locked door my parents could no longer escape through. But the financial records only proved embezzlement from the charity. They did not invalidate the charity itself. The legal front remained dangerous. The probate court still recognized the forged trust amendment as a binding document. I had the evidence that Thomas Davis did not sign it. I had the ledger proving Grandpa Harrison was paralyzed on the day it was executed. But the document bore an official, state-sanctioned seal on the bottom corner. A sworn notary public had stamped that paper. That stamp gave the forgery the illusion of ironclad law. If the state had a licensed official willing to testify that they witnessed the signing, the court might still tie the estate up in years of grueling litigation. My parents could use the delays to drain whatever funds were not currently frozen. I needed to break the legal seal. I needed the name attached to that black ink stamp. With the audit now transitioning into a full-blown fraud investigation, a dark, urgent question loomed over my kitchen table. Who was the missing link? Who possessed an official state seal and was willing to risk federal prison to validate a fake will for my family? My daughter and I functioned as a closed-circuit intelligence loop. Emma provided the raw numerical data flowing through the firm's servers in Helena. I supplied the localized context required to translate those sterile numbers into a coherent criminal timeline. An isolated bank transaction means very little to a forensic accountant examining a ledger. However, when paired with decades of familial history, those digits paint a vivid, undeniable portrait of greed. On Thursday morning, a new encrypted file dropped into my secure cloud drive. Emma had finished scrubbing the outbound wire transfers her boss Marcus demanded she investigate. My brother had labeled the largest cash withdrawals under the vague heading of Administrative Volunteer Outreach. My parents recently claimed he was out of state, processing his grief through charity work. I opened the spreadsheet on my laptop. Emma bypassed the ambiguous categorization and traced the routing numbers directly to the receiving merchant accounts. Mason was indeed out of state. He was in Cabo San Lucas. The administrative outreach was a luxury resort booking. The document detailed a sequence of charges that made my jaw tighten. A beachfront villa rental, premium bottle service at an exclusive nightclub, a private chartered deep-sea fishing excursion. He had billed $25,000 of Grandpa Harrison's legacy to a shadow foundation to fund a tropical vacation. He was drinking top-shelf tequila on a Mexican beach while my mother sat in her living room weeping over probate fees and demanding I leverage my own home to pay her property taxes. I saved the spreadsheet into my master dossier. The financial theft was documented down to the final cent. We possessed the routing numbers, the timestamps, and the merchant receipts. The money trail was locked. But the legal linchpin still bothered me. To secure the stolen millions, the syndicate needed the probate court to validate the trust amendment. To validate the trust amendment, they needed the official state seal of a notary public. I sent Emma a brief message requesting the highest resolution scan available of the original legal filing. She accessed the intake portal, isolated the final page of the amendment, and forwarded the image file. I expanded the image on my monitor. The black ink of the notary stamp was slightly smudged on the physical copy I viewed at the courthouse, obscuring the name registered along the outer ring of the seal. But Emma utilized her firm's proprietary enhancement software to sharpen the contrast. The blurred letters snapped into crisp focus. I read the name etched into the digital circle. Jessica Miller. I leaned back in my chair. The harsh glow of the screen cast long shadows across my kitchen counter. I knew that name. I knew exactly who she was. 2 months prior to Grandpa passing, Mason brought a new girlfriend to Sunday dinner at the ranch. Her name was Jessica. She was a decade younger than my brother, easily impressed by his fake Rolex and empty promises of entrepreneurial success. During dinner, she mentioned her day job. She worked as an assistant manager at a local retail shipping and printing center in downtown Bozeman, a job that required her to hold an active state notary commission. The entire syndicate snapped into perfect alignment. The architecture of their crime was a closed family loop built on hubris and proximity. My father orchestrated the strategy dictating the terms of the fraudulent charity to avoid probate taxes and cut me out of the bloodline. My brother executed the logistics, incorporating the Hollow Foundation using his condominium address and draining the funds for his own lavish lifestyle. My mother provided the fake board of directors, volunteering her own dementia-stricken sister to satisfy the federal tax requirements. And Jessica, the naive girlfriend, eager to please her wealthy new boyfriend, provided the state-sanctioned notary stamp required to legitimize a forged signature on a date when the deceased was physically paralyzed. It was a multi-felony enterprise orchestrated entirely around a dining room table. I organized the physical documents into a thick manila folder. I placed the items in chronological order. First, the pages from Grandpa's leather ledger proving his paralysis. Second, the notarized medical affidavit confirming Aunt Sarah's incapacity. Third, the high-resolution scan of the forged signature alongside Jessica Miller's notary stamp. Finally, the itemized spreadsheet detailing the Cabo San Lucas resort charges. Every single page was a nail in the coffin my family built for themselves. I sat in the quiet of my home, my hands resting on the closed folder. A rational, detached logistics manager would simply drive to the local police precinct. I could hand the dossier to a detective, file a formal complaint with the state attorney general, and let the legal machinery grind my parents into dust. It would be efficient. It would be quiet. But I did not want quiet. My family had spent a lifetime making me feel small in private. They operated behind closed doors. They whispered insults in hallways, cornered me in empty living rooms, and weaponized their grief when no one else was watching. They relied on my stoic nature, banking on the fact that I would absorb their emotional abuse without causing a public scene. If I handed the folder to the police, my parents would hire a crisis management firm. They would spin the narrative. They would stand in front of their country club friends and claim it was all a terrible misunderstanding, a clerical error compounded by a jealous, estranged daughter who manipulated the authorities out of spite. They would play the victim. They would garner sympathy. They would turn the town against me before the trial even began. I refused to allow them to control the narrative. The theft was executed in the shadows, but the reckoning needed to happen in the light. They had built a public lie regarding their philanthropy. That lie required a public execution. I needed to spring the trap while they were surrounded by the very people they sought to impress. The audience had to be undeniable. With my family actively constructing their facade of local prestige, how could I ensure they could not spin their way out of the evidence and play the victim one last time? The envelope waiting in my mailbox was thick, crafted from heavy cream paper. Gold foil lettering stamped across the front caught the afternoon sun. I ran my thumb over the raised texture. It was an invitation to a charity gala hosted by Richard and Barbara Clark to be held at the Bozeman Country Club. The event was billed as the official public launch of the Big Sky Heritage Foundation. They were constructing their public stage. They were not merely stealing a $4 million estate in the shadows. They were laundering their newly acquired wealth in the open, wrapping their greed in the respectable cloak of local philanthropy. The country club represented old money political influence and unshakable reputations. By hosting the launch under those crystal chandeliers, my parents intended to build a shield of civic admiration around their syndicate. I carried the glossy invitation inside and placed it on my kitchen counter, right next to the manila folder containing the forged notary records and my brother's tropical resort receipts. The contrast between the elegant gold foil and the damning evidence was a stark reminder of the illusion they were desperately trying to maintain. The pressure was mounting, and my parents knew I remained an uncontrolled variable. They could not proceed with their grand societal debut while I was quietly requesting probate files at the county courthouse. They needed to neutralize me before the caterers served the first round of appetizers. 3 days later, that neutralization attempt occurred in the most mundane location possible. I stood in the produce aisle of the local grocery store on a Tuesday evening. The fluorescent lights buzzed a low, steady hum overhead. The air smelled of damp earth and citrus. I evaluate my groceries the way I evaluate a freight load. I look for efficiency, quality, and precise weight. I was inspecting a row of green apples when a shadow fell across my shopping cart. My mother wore a tailored cashmere coat. Her hair was sprayed into perfect, motionless waves. She projected the image of a wealthy, unbothered socialite. But her eyes were rigid. The polite, fragile widow mask she wore at the funeral was entirely missing. She did not offer a greeting. She stepped uncomfortably close, invading my personal space. The scent of her expensive floral perfume clashed sharply with the smell of the produce. She knew I despised public confrontations. She intentionally chose a crowded grocery store, banking on my lifelong habit of retreating to avoid a scene. She reached into her designer handbag and extracted a crisp, folded legal document. She placed it carefully on top of my groceries, resting it against a carton of milk. "We need to finalize the estate administration," she said. Her voice was low and clipped. "Your father and I have decided to compensate you for your time and distress during the funeral preparations." I looked down at the paper. It was a formal contract offering a $50,000 consulting fee to be paid directly from the foundation accounts. The catch was printed clearly on the second page. It was a comprehensive liability waiver. If I signed the signature block, I legally relinquished all future rights to contest the will, the trust amendment, or the operations of the charity. They were offering hush money, dressed up as a corporate consulting fee, to buy my silence. I did not touch the paper. I met her rigid gaze. I do not perform any consulting work, Mom. I am a logistics manager. She leaned closer. Her breath brushed my cheek. Take the money, Callie, she whispered. Take it and walk away. If you drag your own family into court over this, you will deeply regret the consequences. I maintained my silence. I just stared into her eyes, offering zero emotional reaction. My heart beat in a slow, calculated rhythm. In a negotiation, silence is a vacuum. The other party will invariably rush to fill it, often revealing their true leverage. The lack of compliance forced her to escalate. She unveiled her final weapon. She launched the psychological strike she had been preparing for days. Bozeman is a small town, she continued, her tone dropping into a threatening register. Reputations dictate everything here. If you challenge this conservation fund, Richard and I will have no choice but to explain your erratic, unstable behavior to the community. We will tell the country club members your employer at the cooperative and the probate judge exactly how you treated your grandfather in his final weeks. She paused, letting the threat hang in the chilled air of the grocery aisle. We will describe the verbal abuse, she said softly. We will detail how you screamed at a dying man, demanding his property while he lay in a hospital bed. We will make sure everyone in this county knows you are a bitter, estranged daughter trying to sabotage a noble charitable cause out of pure spite. She smiled. It was a cold, practiced expression. She expected me to crumble. She expected the threat of social ruin to break my spine. In my 20s, the thought of public humiliation would have paralyzed me. I would have signed the paper just to stop the vicious rumors. But she was threatening a woman who already held her entire criminal syndicate inside a secure digital cloud. She was threatening a woman whose daughter was actively dismantling their financial ledger line by line. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend myself against the fabricated accusation of elder abuse. I did not flinch. I shifted my weight, resting my right hand casually against the exterior pocket of my wool coat. I tapped the heavy fabric twice with my index finger. Montana is a one-party consent state for recording, Mom, I said smoothly. The color drained from her face in an instant, leaving her skin a pale, chalky white. Her gaze darted down to my coat pocket, searching for the outline of a mobile phone, and then snapped back up to my eyes. The tailored cashmere coat suddenly looked too heavy for her shrinking frame. She swallowed hard. Her throat worked visibly against a sudden, severe lack of moisture. Under state law, only one person in a conversation needs to consent to an audio recording. I did not confirm whether my phone was actively capturing her extortion attempt. The mere possibility that she had just threatened to fabricate elder abuse onto a digital audio file stripped her of all her power. I picked up the folded legal waiver from my cart. I held it out to her. She took the paper with trembling fingers. I pushed my shopping cart past her, walking down the bright aisle without looking back. I left her stranded between the organic vegetables, breathing shallowly under the buzzing fluorescent lights, realizing her intimidation tactics no longer worked. The pressure was reaching a critical threshold. My parents knew I was an active, unpredictable threat, but they could not cancel the upcoming gala. The invitations were already mailed. The catering deposits were paid. They had to proceed with their grand illusion. But to successfully sell a fake conservation charity to the wealthy donors of Bozeman, they needed a centerpiece. They could not simply ask for monetary donations to a vague wildlife fund. They needed a physical asset to parade in front of the local politicians and business leaders to prove their legitimacy. Mason was orchestrating a major real estate acquisition. He promised the country club elite a monumental announcement that evening. He intended to cement his legacy as a brilliant environmental steward. What massive purchase was Mason planning to unveil at the gala to legitimize the fake charity? The gala was 3 days away. The clock, ticking down the hours, felt less like a deadline and more like a metronome, establishing a steady, inevitable rhythm for the reckoning. My home office became a command center. Papers were stacked in neat geometric grids across my desk. Emma and I were no longer just communicating via encrypted text messages. We established an open channel. She operated from her cubicle in Helena, diving through the digital strata of the firm's secure servers. I operated from Bozeman, compiling the physical evidence. We functioned as a synchronized forensics strike team, merging the cold analytics of corporate accounting with the intimate, ugly knowledge of a family's history. On Wednesday afternoon, Emma achieved a critical breakthrough. The internal fraud investigation initiated by her mentor Marcus yielded enough glaring inconsistencies to pause the probate certification indefinitely. Emma called me from a secure line. Her voice held the crisp efficiency of a professional who had successfully isolated the variable. "I just concluded a meeting with Marcus," she said. "I presented the timeline of the outbound wire transfers. He reviewed the missing vendor invoices and the unauthorized withdrawals routing directly into a secondary LLC." "What was his assessment?" I asked, leaning back in my desk chair. "He authorized a direct confrontation," Emma replied. "He stated the data irregularities suggest severe fiduciary mismanagement. He wants an analyst on the ground to formally challenge the client's ledger entries. He offered to send a senior associate, but I volunteered. I told him I mapped the architecture so I know the pressure points. He approved my request. I am officially authorized to demand an explanation from the Big Sky Heritage Foundation on behalf of the firm." Marcus had just unwittingly handed my daughter a loaded gun. He authorized her to walk into the Bozeman Country Club, confront the foundation directors, and dismantle their financial ledgers in person. He still possessed no idea the hostile client attempting to bribe his firm was his analyst's own grandfather. The dramatic irony was a heavy, potent weapon we were preparing to unsheath in front of 100 people. With Emma securing the financial authority, I focused entirely on the legal documentation. I opened a fresh, reinforced manila folder. I did not want digital files stored on a tablet that could glitch or crash. I wanted physical paper. Paper carries weight. Paper makes a sound when it hits a table. Paper cannot be deleted. I began the assembly process. There is a deep, profound satisfaction in organizing the exact instruments of your abuser's destruction. The methodical nature of the task quieted the lingering anxiety in my chest. First, I inserted the high-resolution scan of the forged trust amendment, placing it directly next to an authentic legal document bearing Thomas Davis's actual signature. The vertical, hesitant slant of the forgery was glaringly obvious. Next, I added the enhanced image of the notary stamp, Jessica Miller. The name was crisp and undeniable. I followed that with the medical documents. I slid the notarized affidavit from the Whispering Pines Care Center into the folder, legally confirming Aunt Sarah's severe dementia and her inability to serve on any corporate board. Then came the financial receipts. I printed Emma's detailed spreadsheet documenting the $25,000 of charity funds wired to the Cabo San Lucas luxury resort. Finally, I placed the copies of the pages from Grandpa Harrison's leather ledger at the very top of the stack. The erratic, jagged handwriting proving his paralysis on the date of the supposed signing served as the cornerstone of the entire operation. The folder was heavy. It contained a comprehensive record of forgery, elder exploitation, embezzlement, and systemic corporate fraud. My parents built their syndicate on lies and intimidation. I was dismantling it with dates and routing numbers. While I finalized the physical dossier, my brother was actively escalating his public relations campaign. Mason understood that a charity requires a visible impact to attract wealthy donors. You cannot solicit significant capital based solely on a vague promise of conservation. He was broadcasting his grand vision to the local elite. He gave an interview to the Bozeman Civic newsletter promoting a monumental environmental initiative the foundation was set to execute. He promised to unveil a major land acquisition at the upcoming gala. He claimed the charity was purchasing a massive tract of undeveloped acreage to create a pristine, protected wildlife preserve. He intended to project the image of a visionary environmental steward. He thought he was executing a brilliant, sophisticated maneuver. He believed purchasing raw land would legitimize the Foundation's mission and secure his status among the local power brokers. But Mason had never possessed my eye for detail. He was a man drawn to the spotlight, ignoring the foundational mechanics required to support the structure. He viewed real estate as a prop for his ego. I viewed real estate as a logistical asset requiring rigorous zoning verification. If Mason was utilizing stolen charity funds to acquire acreage, I needed to know exactly what he was buying. I called Emma back. She answered immediately, the sound of her keyboard clacking softly in the background. Emma Mason is boasting about a massive land purchase for a wildlife preserve, I said. He is going to announce it at the country club. I need to know where this land is located. Give me 2 minutes, she replied. If he initiated a purchase agreement, the escrow transfer will be logged in the Foundation's pending outbound wires. I listened to her type. The silence on the line was tight anticipatory. Got it, Emma said. The Foundation initiated a heavy capital transfer into an escrow holding account 3 days ago. The memo line designates a real estate acquisition. I am pulling the GPS coordinates from the attached parcel deed now. She read the latitude and longitude coordinates aloud. I typed them into the county surveyor's public database on my monitor. The digital map zoomed in on a specific tract of land located 20 miles outside the city limits, situated near an old industrial highway junction. I stared at the screen. The satellite imagery revealed a desolate, barren expanse of dirt and rusted metal fencing. It was not a pristine forest. It was not a lush meadow suitable for a wildlife preserve. I zoomed closer, examining the public zoning overlays. A stark red boundary line encompassed the entire parcel. A cold, sharp realization settled over me. Mason was not buying a pristine sanctuary. He was executing a maneuver far more dangerous than simple embezzlement. His arrogance had blinded him to the structural reality of his purchase. He was about to stand on a stage in front of the wealthiest donors in the county and proudly claim ownership of that specific acreage. What deadly secret was hiding in the soil of Mason's supposed wildlife preserve that would seal his absolute, inescapable ruin? The red boundary line pulsing on my monitor was not a standard zoning demarcation. In county surveying maps, residential plots are coded in pale yellow. Commercial zones are mapped in muted blue. A thick, stark red boundary indicates a severe federal restriction. I kept the phone pressed to my ear. Emma was waiting on the open line, listening to the silence stretch across the connection. Emma, I said, keeping my tone steady, I need you to take that parcel identification number and run it through the Federal Environmental Registry. Check the EPA database for active remediation grids. I heard her keyboard clatter as she opened a new search terminal. While the database compiled the results, my mind drifted back to a Thanksgiving dinner 3 years ago. Mason had sat at the head of the table drinking dark beer and lecturing anyone who would listen about the oppressive nature of government bureaucracy. He had recently lost a lucrative commercial development deal on the edge of town. A routine soil test had revealed minor chemical runoff from an old gas station, and the state halted his construction permits. He complained bitterly for an hour, waving his fork and declaring that environmental regulations were designed solely to ruin visionary real estate developers. He believed the rules were bureaucratic red tape meant for lesser minds, obstacles a truly clever businessman could simply sidestep or ignore. He always wanted to be a real estate mogul. He wanted to build sprawling commercial strip malls and collect high-end retail rent. He just never possessed the capital or the patience to execute the vision legally. I have the registry file, Emma said. Her voice broke my reverie. The professional detachment in her tone was gone, replaced by a stunned, hollow disbelief. Mom, you are not going to believe what he just bought. Read it to me, I said. This parcel is not zoned for a wildlife preserve, Emma read from her screen. It is an abandoned industrial lot. 40 years ago, it operated as a smelting facility and battery disposal plant. The ground is saturated with industrial lead arsenic and chemical runoff. It is a federally designated EPA Superfund site. It ranks on the national priority list for hazardous waste. I stared at the red boundary line on my screen. The audacity of his scheme was breathtaking, matched only by his profound ignorance. Mason was utilizing the stolen inheritance to purchase toxic wasteland for pennies on the dollar. He intended to stand on a stage and sell the wealthy donors a heartwarming narrative about land rehabilitation and environmental stewardship. He would use the civic goodwill generated by the fake charity to grease the palms of the local zoning board. He figured the town council would applaud the Big Sky Heritage Foundation for taking an ugly, abandoned industrial lot and promising to clean it up for the wildlife. Then, once the zoning board relaxed the restrictions under the guise of charitable rehabilitation, Mason would execute the final phase of his plan. He would quietly pivot, claim the land was better suited for economic development, rezone the parcel for commercial use, and build his dream strip mall. He thought he had discovered a brilliant loophole to bypass the very environmental regulations he despised. He thought he was outsmarting the federal government. He was a fool. In my line of work, we deal with hazardous material transport. I understand the rigid, unforgiving architecture of federal environmental law. The Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act governs Superfund sites. The law imposes strict joint and several liability. It does not matter if you caused the toxic spill or if you bought the land decades after the factory closed. The moment your name is stamped on the property deed, you legally absorb the financial burden of the cleanup. Emma, pull the federal remediation estimate for that specific grid I instructed. Her keyboard clicked rapidly. Got it. The EPA projected cost for topsoil removal, groundwater filtration, and long-term hazardous monitoring is estimated at $10 million. I let out a slow, quiet breath. The math settled over the room. By directing the foundation escrow account to purchase that specific parcel, Mason did not just execute a bad real estate deal. He legally attached a $10 million federal debt to the Big Sky Heritage Foundation. The charity only held the $4 million stolen from Grandpa Harrison. Mason had just bankrupted the entire trust in a single signature. But the catastrophic failure of his plan ran much deeper than a bankrupt charity. Corporate entities usually shield their directors from liability. However, my parents and my brother operated a fraudulent shell corporation. They forged a trust amendment, installed a fake board of directors, and engaged in active embezzlement. When the federal government realizes a foundation cannot pay a $10 million environmental cleanup bill, the EPA investigates the corporate structure. They would easily pierce the fragile corporate veil my family had constructed. The federal government would hold the directors personally liable for the toxic debt. Mason, Richard, and Barbara were about to be on the hook for $10 million they did not possess. They had stolen an inheritance to fund a life of luxury, and in their arrogant rush to legitimize the theft, they accidentally constructed their own financial guillotine. Print the EPA registry designation and the remediation cost estimate, I told Emma. The corners of my mouth lifted. A genuine, cold smile broke across my face for the first time in 6 months. Bring those documents with you tonight. I closed the public records browser on my monitor. I opened my heavy manila folder. I left a space at the very back of the chronological stack for Emma's new paperwork. The folder was now a perfect lethal weapon. It contained the forgery, the perjury, the embezzlement, and the fatal toxic liability. I pushed my chair back from the desk and walked into my bedroom. The evening light was fading, casting deep shadows across the floor. I opened my closet. I reached past my heavy work jackets and flannel shirts. I pulled out a simple, tailored black dress. It was unadorned, practical, and sharp. It was the kind of garment you wear when you want to fade into the background of a room, allowing the people around you to draw all the attention. It was armor. I laid the dress across my bed. I retrieved a pair of sensible black heels. I checked my reflection in the mirror. My face was calm. My hands were steady. The anxiety that had gripped my chest since the day of the funeral was entirely gone, replaced by a quiet, profound certainty. My family had rented a ballroom. They had hired a caterer. They had invited the wealthiest, most influential citizens of Gallatin County to witness their grand societal debut. They intended to stand under the crystal chandeliers and accept the applause and the donation checks of their peers. It was time to go to a party. I gathered my keys and the heavy manila folder. I walked out to my truck, the cold evening air crisp against my lungs. My parents were eager to show Bozeman their brilliant investment. They were eager to collect the money. How would the local elite react when they realized the visionary conservation project they were funding was actually a toxic wasteland destined to attract the wrath of the federal government? We returned to the opening scene. The Bozeman Country Club is a sprawling, cedar-beamed lodge nestled against the foothills, designed to project an aura of rugged, exclusionary wealth. The circular driveway was choked with imported SUVs and luxury sedans. A valet in a crisp uniform took the keys to my battered work truck. I stepped onto the polished stone portico, the heavy manila folder tucked securely under my arm. I wore the simple black dress. No jewelry, no extravagant makeup. I looked like an auditor arriving for a shift, which was precisely the point. I pushed through the heavy oak doors and entered the main ballroom. The heat of the room hit me instantly, carrying the scent of expensive prime rib, melting ice sculptures, and the sharp floral tang of high-end perfumes. The space was packed. My parents had cast a wide net, inviting over 100 of the most influential citizens in Gallatin County. Local politicians, bank managers, real estate developers, and prominent ranchers stood in tight, murmuring clusters. This was the culmination of their criminal enterprise. They had stolen $4 million in the dark, and now they were spending a portion of it to purchase the respect and admiration of the town. I navigated toward the perimeter of the room, keeping my back near the wall. I did not want to engage in small talk. I wanted a clear line of sight to the exits and the main stage. Near the elaborate ice sculpture of a soaring eagle, I spotted Jessica Miller. Mason's young girlfriend stood alone, clutching a crystal flute of champagne. She wore a sequined gown that looked slightly out of place among the understated cashmere and silk of the older crowd. She looked profoundly uncomfortable. She kept checking her phone, her eyes darting nervously toward the entrance, taking rapid, shallow sips from her glass. I studied her rigid posture. She was a retail shipping clerk who had likely never attended a gala of this magnitude. Her sudden elevation into the inner circle of a multi-million-dollar foundation was clearly terrifying her. She knew her name was stamped on the forged legal document anchoring the entire charity. The weight of that perjury was visible in the tight, anxious set of her jaw. She was the weakest link in the chain, and the sheer scale of the event was causing her to fracture. I cataloged her location and continued my slow sweep of the room. My mother intercepted me near the grand staircase. Barbara wore a deep emerald gown, pearls resting against her collarbone. She detached herself from a conversation with the county commissioner and stepped directly into my path. Her smile remained fixed for the benefit of the surrounding guests, but her eyes were cold, calculating stones. "You actually came," she whispered, her voice dropping into a harsh, sibilant hiss. "I am surprised you have the nerve to show your face here after refusing our generous offer in the grocery store." I said nothing. I held the manila folder against my side. "Do not cause a scene." "Callie," she commanded, leaning closer. "We have the mayor here tonight. We have the Rotary Club president. People are writing significant donation checks to support this foundation. If you do anything to embarrass this family, I promise you, I will make good on my threat. I will ruin your professional reputation in this town before breakfast tomorrow." I employed the absolute silence she hated. I offered zero reaction to the threat. I did not glare, I did not flinch. I gave her a blank, unreadable stare. My lack of compliance unsettled her. The mask slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing a flicker of genuine apprehension. She turned sharply and walked back toward the VIP tables, her heels clicking loudly against the hardwood floor. She believed the donation checks being written by the wealthy guests were a shield. She thought the civic momentum of the event protected the charity from scrutiny. Her ignorance regarding financial law was staggering. By hosting this gala, distributing promotional materials, promising to use the funds for conservation, and actively accepting monetary donations across state banking lines, My parents were committing a severe escalation of their initial crime. They were no longer simply embezzling a private family inheritance. They were soliciting public funds under false pretenses. They had just crossed the legal threshold into federal wire fraud and interstate charity scams. Every single check dropped into the collection box near the entrance added another potential year to a federal prison sentence. I walked toward the coat check alcove, a quiet, shadowed corner offering a panoramic view of the ballroom. I requested a glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter. I leaned against the polished oak counter and waited. 5 minutes later, the heavy front doors opened. Emma walked in. She did not look like my daughter tonight. She looked like a corporate executioner. She wore a sharp, tailored navy suit. Her hair was pulled back into a severe professional knot. She carried her firm's heavy leather briefcase in her left hand. She bypassed the coat check, ignored the welcoming committee, and walked directly toward a small reserved table near the back of the room, taking her seat with quiet authority. We did not exchange a greeting. We did not make eye contact. Our operational protocols were firmly established. I watched my parents work the room. Richard laughed loudly at a joke told by a local developer, clapping the man on the back. Mason glad-handed a group of young investors, pointing enthusiastically toward the grand stage erected at the far end of the ballroom. They were arrogant, untouchable, and completely intoxicated by their own perceived brilliance. They had no idea the architect of their destruction was sipping sparkling water by the coats, holding the physical proof of their forgery. They had no idea the auditor, who possessed the digital proof of their embezzlement, was sitting 30 feet away, waiting for her cue. The trap was fully set. The audience of their peers was seated, holding fresh drinks and waiting to be impressed. The microphones on the stage hummed with live power, ready to broadcast their lies to the entire room. The lights dimmed. A hush fell over the crowd. The spotlight hit the center of the stage. My father stepped up to the podium, tapping the microphone to ensure the room had his attention. The silence that followed was total. The execution was about to begin. How far into the fabricated narrative would my brother commit his foundation before the jaws of the trap snapped shut around him? The dessert plates were cleared away by a silent army of waitstaff. The low murmur of conversation settled as the ballroom lights dimmed to a soft amber glow. The hum of the sound system signaled the transition from the social hour to the main event. Mason strode up the short steps to the center stage. He adjusted the lapels of his tailored tuxedo. He possessed an easy, fluid charisma. It was the natural confidence of a boy who had never faced a consequence he could not charm his way out of. He was the golden child of the Clark family. While I spent my youth repairing fences and auditing feed manifests, Mason was praised simply for entering a room. He operated on the belief that reality was flexible, easily reshaped by a winning smile and a convincing story. He gripped the edges of the wooden podium and looked out over the sea of wealthy donors. He allowed a heavy, poignant silence to stretch across the room before he spoke. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Mason began. His voice was pitched to a perfect, resonant baritone. "Tonight is about legacy. It is about honoring a man who loved the Montana soil more than anything else in this world. My grandfather, Harrison Clark." He paused, bowing his head. A soft, sympathetic murmur rippled through the audience. I stood in the shadows near the coat check alcove, my fingers curled tightly around the edge of the manila folder. I watched him perform. The last few days of his life were the hardest trial our family has ever faced. Mason continued, his tone turning intimate and fragile. But they were also the most profound. I sat by his hospice bed for hours. I held his hand as the monitors faded. And in those quiet moments just before he passed, he looked at me. He squeezed my fingers. He told me his final wish was to give back to the wilderness that sustained our family for generations. He asked me to save the land. The air in my lungs turned to ice. The sheer, staggering weight of the lie hit me with a physical force. Mason was not at the hospital when Grandpa Harrison died. He was not sitting by a sterile hospice bed. He was 300 miles away, standing in the lift line at an exclusive ski resort in Aspen, Colorado. I knew this because I had seen the photos he posted to his social media accounts that very afternoon, grinning behind mirrored goggles while holding a pair of expensive skis. I was the one sitting in the quiet antiseptic hospital room. I was the one listening to the rhythmic, mechanical hiss of the oxygen machine. I held that calloused, weather-beaten hand as the warmth slowly left it. Grandpa Harrison did not offer a final, poetic mandate about conservation. His final act was a silent, labored breath before his heart simply stopped. My brother was weaponizing a sacred, painful memory he never even bothered to attend. He was using the ghost of a man he ignored to pry open the checkbooks of the local elite. I did not react. I kept my breathing slow and measured. I cataloged the perjury. Mason lifted his head, projecting a sudden, inspiring energy. And that is why we established the Big Sky Heritage Foundation, he declared, to fulfill his dying promise. We are not just raising awareness tonight. We are taking immediate, concrete action. He pressed a button on a small remote. The large projector screen behind him flared to life. A sprawling high-definition map illuminated the dark stage. It was a masterpiece of graphic design. The acreage was shaded in deep, lush greens, highlighted with bright blue lines indicating pristine water sources. It looked like an untouched sanctuary, a perfect haven for native wildlife. "This is the future," Mason announced, gesturing expansively toward the screen. "We have entered into an exclusive escrow agreement to acquire this vital tract of wilderness located just outside the city limits. This parcel will serve as our flagship preserve. It will be protected from commercial development forever." He leaned into the microphone, his voice thick with urgency. "But we cannot finalize this monumental acquisition without your support. We need to close the funding gap. I am asking every person in this room to look deep into your hearts and double your initial pledges tonight. Help us secure this land. Help us honor my grandfather." The audience erupted into enthusiastic applause. Several prominent business owners nodded in solemn agreement, reaching into their suit jackets for their checkbooks. They were looking at a digitally enhanced map of a lush forest. They had no idea the coordinates on that screen corresponded to a barren, toxic wasteland saturated with industrial lead and arsenic. They were actively bidding to fund an environmental disaster carrying a $10 million federal liability. Mason smiled humbly, soaking in the adulation. He stepped back and handed the microphone to my father. Richard took the podium. He radiated a smug, unshakable triumph. He believed he had won. He believed the foundation was now a permanent, untouchable fixture in the community. But a man like my father never settles for a simple victory. He required total validation. He needed to prove to his wealthy peers that his operation was flawless, legitimate, and superior to any standard charity. "Thank you, Mason," my father said. "As you can see, our vision is ambitious, but ambition requires accountability." He looked across the room, projecting the image of a responsible corporate steward. "When we established this foundation, I insisted on absolute transparency. I demanded that our financial ledgers be subjected to the most rigorous scrutiny available. We did not hire a local bookkeeper. We retained the premier forensic accounting firm in the state capital to conduct a comprehensive, independent audit of our estate transition." He paused, letting the prestige of the statement settle over the crowd. "I am proud to announce that our auditing firm has concluded their review." Richard continued, his voice ringing with ultimate hubris.
"And to prove our total transparency, our independent auditor is here with us tonight to present their final certificate of approval, verifying that every single dollar is accounted for and properly allocated."
My father extended his arm, gesturing grandly toward the back of the ballroom. He looked directly toward the reserve tables near the coat check. He expected Marcus. He expected the senior partner he had attempted to bribe to stand up, walk to the stage, and deliver a sanitized, compliant speech, rubber stamping the forged ledger. The crowd clapped politely. 100 heads turned in unison, shifting in their seats to locate the distinguished financial expert stepping into the light. The applause echoed in the cavernous space. I stepped away from the oak counter. I moved out of the shadows and stood in the center of the main aisle. The heavy manila folder rested securely in my right hand. At the exact same moment, 10 feet to my left, Emma pushed her chair back from the small reserve table. She picked up her firm's leather briefcase. She smoothed the front of her navy suit. My father's smile froze. His extended arm hung suspended in the air. The confident, triumphant posture evaporated in a single heartbeat. His eyes darted from my rigid stance to the young woman walking purposefully toward the center aisle. The polite applause began to falter, tapering off into a confused, uneven smattering of claps as the guests sensed the sudden, drastic shift in the atmosphere on the stage. What happens when the independent auditor stepping into the spotlight is the granddaughter you tried to erase? The scattered clapping withered into an uncomfortable, hollow silence. My father stood paralyzed behind the wooden podium. His arm, which had been swept out in a grand welcoming gesture just moments prior, slowly dropped to his side. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin an ashen, sickly gray. He was staring directly at the young woman walking purposefully down the center aisle. He expected a silver-haired senior partner. He expected a man he could negotiate with, a man he had attempted to bribe over a recorded telephone line. Instead, he recognized the sharp, undeniable features of his estranged granddaughter. He had not spoken to Emma in 5 years. Now she was approaching his stage, holding a heavy leather briefcase containing the digital blueprint of his financial ruin. Emma did not rush. She moved with the measured, terrifying precision of an apex predator circling a wounded animal. She climbed the short set of carpeted stairs. My brother Mason took a reflexive step backward, his charismatic smile collapsing into a look of genuine confusion. He did not know who she was. He only recognized the sudden, ambient terror radiating from our father. Richard opened his mouth, perhaps to call for security, perhaps to interject, but his throat seized. Emma stepped past him. She placed her briefcase on the surface of the podium. She reached out and adjusted the microphone. The slight screech of audio feedback made a few guests wince. "Good evening," Emma said. Her voice was steady, calm, and amplified to fill every corner of the vast room. "My name is Emma Lawson. I am the lead forensic analyst assigned to investigate the financial architecture of the Big Sky Heritage Foundation." She looked out over the sea of upturned faces. Wealthy donors, local politicians, and business leaders waited in breathless anticipation, expecting a glowing review of the charity. "And I am officially declining to certify this estate," she stated. The ballroom went entirely still. The clinking of silverware ceased. A waiter carrying a tray of coffee cups halted mid-stride. Emma popped the brass latches on her briefcase. The sharp clicks echoed like gunshots. She extracted a stack of printed spreadsheets and legal affidavits. She did not yell. She did not express anger. She delivered the facts with the clinical detachment of a medical examiner determining a cause of death. "This foundation is a fraudulent shell corporation," Emma continued. "The independent board of directors listed on their federal tax filings is fabricated. One of the primary board members is a 78-year-old woman currently residing in a specialized memory care facility suffering from advanced stage dementia. She has lacked the legal capacity to sign a document for over 3 years." A collective gasp rippled through the front row. The mayor leaned forward, his brow furrowed in severe alarm. My mother, seated at the primary VIP table just below the stage, gripped the edges of her chair. Her emerald gown suddenly looked like a cage she could not escape. Emma held up the first spreadsheet. "Furthermore, the capital allocated for charitable outreach has been actively embezzled. Last week, an outbound wire transfer of $25,000 was categorized as an administrative grant. I traced the routing numbers. That money was not spent on environmental conservation. It was spent at a luxury beachfront resort in Cabo San Lucas, paying for premium bottle service and private fishing charters under the name of your executive director, Mason Clark." A low, angry murmur began to build in the back of the room. Donors who had just written checks for thousands of dollars stared at my brother. Mason looked like he had been struck by lightning. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound emerged. He glanced at Richard, seeking rescue, but our father was staring blankly at the floor. But the financial irregularities are merely symptoms of a much deeper crime, Emma said, her voice cutting through the rising unrest. The foundational document establishing this charity is a forgery. The trust amendment transferring the estate assets was notarized on a Tuesday in late October. Emma reached over and tapped a key on Mason's laptop, still connected to the main projection system. The digitally enhanced map of the fake wildlife preserve vanished. It was replaced by a high-resolution photograph of Grandpa Harrison's leather ledger. The erratic, jagged handwriting filled the large screen behind the stage. I am projecting the daily medical log kept by the deceased Emma, explained to the crowd. On the exact date the legal amendment was supposedly executed, the deceased suffered a severe rheumatoid arthritis flare-up. He was medically paralyzed. His hands were numb. He could not hold a pen. He was physically incapable of signing his own name. The document, transferring $4 million to this charity, was forged, and the notary stamp validating it was secured through perjury. The ballroom descended into an ugly, volatile silence. The reality of the theft settled over the crowd. These were proud people. They did not like being deceived, and they particularly despised being used as props in a common grift. I stepped out of the center aisle. I walked toward the front of the room. The guests parted for me, recognizing the woman my mother had spent the evening trying to hide. I approached the primary VIP table where Barbara sat frozen. Richard descended the stairs on trembling legs, moving toward his wife like a man wading through deep water. I stopped directly in front of my parents. I lifted the heavy manila folder. I dropped it onto the white linen tablecloth. The heavy thud rattled the crystal water glasses. "You should have just given me the lower pastures," I said. My voice was low, carrying only to the people seated at the immediate tables. But the finality of the statement struck my father like a physical blow. He looked down at the folder. He knew exactly what it contained. It was the physical manifestation of the digital execution his granddaughter had just delivered. The air in the room grew thick with tension. The donors who had written checks mere minutes ago began standing up. Chairs scraped harshly against the polished floor. The Rotary Club president, a man who built his fortune on local handshakes and trust, marched directly toward the stage, demanding his donation envelope back. I stood my ground, maintaining my stoic posture. I watched the illusion of the Clark family dynasty crumble into dust. For decades, Richard and Barbara controlled the narrative. They utilized shame, emotional manipulation, and financial leverage to keep me quiet. They demanded my compliance and punished my independence. They thought they could execute a multi-million-dollar heist and silence me with a grocery store threat. They failed to understand that a logistics manager views a threat as a logistical flaw. It is a variable to be isolated and neutralized. My mother looked up at me. The tailored waves of her hair seemed stiff, unnatural. Her eyes darted frantically around the room, searching for an ally, a friendly face, a sympathetic nod. She found nothing but disgust. The local politicians were actively distancing themselves, retreating toward the lobby to avoid the impending scandal. The bank managers were whispering rapidly into their mobile phones, likely freezing the foundation accounts before the night ended. Mason remained on the stage entirely abandoned. The charismatic glow that defined his entire existence had vanished, leaving behind a terrified, hollow shell. He looked down at his $15,000 watch, the timepiece purchased with stolen funds, as if it could somehow reverse the last 5 minutes. Near the ice sculpture, Jessica Miller made her move. The young notary public recognized the lethal danger of the projected ledger. She understood that federal investigators would trace the forged stamp directly to her shipping store desk. She dropped her champagne flute. The crystal shattered against the hardwood floor. She turned and fled through the service doors, sprinting toward the parking lot, abandoning my brother to face the consequences alone. I did not feel joy. I did not feel a vindictive thrill. I felt a profound, cold peace. The ledger was balanced. The missing freight was accounted for. Emma stepped down from the podium. She snapped her briefcase shut, the brass latches echoing a final, definitive closure. She walked down the steps and took her place beside me. We stood, shoulder to shoulder, a united front of data and documentation, watching the syndicate devour itself. The psychological pressure inside the ballroom reached a breaking point. The illusion of unity among the thieves dissolved. When the consequences of a crime shift from hypothetical risks to immediate, tangible ruin, loyalty evaporates. The panicked instinct for self-preservation takes over. Trapped in a room full of furious donors, surrounded by the wreckage of their grand societal debut, how fast would the family turn on each other to avoid federal prison? The collapse of the Clark family syndicate did not unfold over months of grueling litigation. It occurred in exactly 3 minutes. The silence that followed my statement shattered into a cacophony of overlapping outrage. The realization of the fraud rippled outward from the VIP tables to the back rows of the ballroom. Donors who had been clapping politely moments before now demanded their money back. The air grew thick with accusations. When a criminal enterprise built on arrogance is exposed to sudden, intense heat, the structural integrity fails immediately. The thieves do not stand together in solidarity. They scramble to locate the nearest exit, eager to push their co-conspirators into the flames. My mother broke first. Barbara stared at the manila folder I dropped onto the white linen tablecloth. She recognized the threat of federal prison staring back at her. The tailored, unbothered socialite persona evaporated. Her self-preservation instincts overrode decades of maternal loyalty. She turned her venom away from me and unleashed it on her youngest son. She stood up, her emerald gown catching on the edge of the chair, and pointed a trembling finger toward the stage. "This was your idea," she screamed at Mason, her voice shrill and desperate, cutting through the ambient noise of the angry donors. "You told us we needed a board of directors. You told me it was just a formality. You used my sister. You exploited your own aunt to cover up your theft. I had nothing to do with those tax filings." Mason, still frozen near the podium, looked at his mother in profound shock. The golden boy, accustomed to endless protection and unearned praise, was suddenly thrust into the role of the scapegoat. The betrayal short-circuited his natural charm. He reacted with raw, panicked fury. He gripped the microphone. "Do not try to pin this on me," he yelled back, his baritone voice cracking under the strain. "I did not forge the lawyer's signature. I did not write the trust amendment. That was all Dad. He orchestrated the entire transition. He was the one who bullied Jessica into stamping the document. He promised her it was a legal loophole. I just followed his instructions to set up the foundation accounts." He was broadcasting a full confession over the country club sound system. He was detailing the hierarchy of the conspiracy in front of 100 witnesses, including city council members and influential corporate executives. My father stood halfway between the table and the stage, physically caught in the crossfire of his imploding family. His hands were curled into tight fists. He looked at Barbara, who was hyperventilating near the spilled water glasses, and then at Mason, who was actively testifying against him. He realized with sudden, terrifying clarity that the people he manipulated for years were now actively feeding him to the wolves. "Shut up, Richard," roared his voice, booming across the ballroom. "Both of you shut your mouths right now. Do not say another word." But it was far too late to issue orders. The damage was absolute. They had dismantled their own syndicate in front of the exact audience they sought to impress. The public relations campaign was over. The criminal investigation had effectively just concluded before it even officially began. Near the front row, a heavy, deliberate scraping sound drew my attention. Chief of Police David Reynolds pushed his chair back from the VIP table. Reynolds was a pragmatic, no-nonsense law enforcement veteran who had served the county for 2 decades. He attended the gala as an invited dignitary, expecting a free prime rib dinner and a polite speech about conservation. Instead, he was handed a multi-million-dollar fraud case wrapped in a tidy bow. He did not draw his weapon. He did not unclip his radio or shout dramatic orders to lock the doors. He simply stood up, adjusted his suit jacket, and walked toward the stage. His expression was a mask of cold, professional disgust. The angry donors parted for him, offering a clear path to the podium. Reynolds ascended the short stairs. He approached Mason. My brother was hyperventilating, his eyes wide and panicked. The chief did not offer a Miranda warning immediately. He did not need to. He simply extended his right hand, palm up. "Hand me the foundation checkbook, Mason," the chief said quietly. His voice did not echo over the microphone, but the command carried a heavy, undeniable authority. "Hand it over and step away from the podium." Mason hesitated for a fraction of a second, his fingers twitching against the polished wood. Then the reality of the uniform broke his resistance. He reached into the interior pocket of his tuxedo jacket, pulled out the leather-bound corporate checkbook, and placed it in the chief's outstretched hand. Reynolds slid the checkbook into his own pocket. He turned his attention to my father, who was standing paralyzed near the bottom of the stairs. "Richard," the chief said, his tone devoid of any former social warmth, "I need you to step out into the hallway. Now. We are going to have a very long conversation about forgery and wire fraud." My father opened his mouth, perhaps to argue, perhaps to invoke his standing in the community, but the words died in his throat. He looked around the ballroom. He saw the wealthy donors clutching their checkbooks. He saw his wife refusing to meet his eye. He saw his son trembling on the stage. He had no leverage left. He lowered his head and walked slowly toward the exit, a broken, defeated man. Emma and I did not linger to watch the arrests. We did not stay to witness the screaming matches or the frantic phone calls to defense attorneys. We had accomplished our objective. We delivered the payload. The logistics of the operation were successfully concluded. I picked up the manila folder from the table. I did not look at my mother as I turned away. Emma descended the stage, her briefcase secured firmly in her grip. We walked shoulder to shoulder down the center aisle, moving against the tide of confused and angry guests. We pushed through the heavy oak doors of the country club and stepped out onto the portico. The Montana night air was sharp and freezing, a welcome shock to the system after the suffocating heat of the ballroom. The sky was clear, the stars burning bright against the black canopy. We walked to my truck in silence. I unlocked the doors. We climbed inside. I started the engine, the heater roaring to life, blasting warm air over my cold hands. I put the truck in gear and drove down the winding mountain road, leaving the flashing lights of arriving patrol cars far behind us. We had dismantled a criminal enterprise, reclaimed a stolen legacy, and exposed decades of manipulation without ever raising our voices. The silence we maintained was not a weakness. It was a tactical advantage. But the legal machinery was only just beginning to turn. The local police would handle the forgery and the embezzlement. The state attorney general would manage the civil restitution. Those consequences were predictable. They involved lawyers' plea deals and standard prison sentences. There was a deeper, more catastrophic liability looming over the Clark family, a liability they actively courted without understanding the danger. By utilizing stolen funds to purchase a contaminated industrial lot, they had inadvertently summoned a force far more relentless than a local police chief. They had triggered the attention of the federal government. As the truck headlights pierced the dark road ahead, I considered the scale of their impending ruin. They thought they were outsmarting the system. They thought they found a brilliant loophole. What ultimate, inescapable consequence would the law hand down to complete their financial and personal destruction? The justice system does not operate with the swift, dramatic pacing of a television broadcast. It moves like a glacier. It is slow, unyielding, and capable of crushing anything caught in its path. Over the next 18 months, I watched that legal glacier grind the Clark family syndicate into fine dust. The local proceedings were a mere formality. With Emma's forensic audit entered into the public record and Grandpa Harrison's physical ledger submitted as sworn evidence, the county probate judge required less than 20 minutes to issue a ruling. The fraudulent trust amendment was struck down. The original will was reinstated. The deed to the ranch, the commercial farming equipment, and the lower pastures transferred directly into my name, honoring the true intent of the man who built it all. Loyalty among thieves is a fragile, temporary construct. Jessica Miller, terrified by the prospect of a federal perjury indictment, secured a defense attorney the morning after the country club debacle. She recognized she was the expendable pawn in my father's game. She handed over every email, every text message, and a detailed chronological timeline of Richard coaching her through the falsified notarization process. She surrendered her state notary commission, pleaded guilty to a lesser charge, and accepted a deferred sentence. Her cooperation sealed the perimeter. My brother recognized the insurmountable weight of the evidence. Without his golden charm to shield him, Mason crumbled. He accepted a plea arrangement offered by the district attorney. To avoid a lengthy prison sentence, he turned state's evidence against his own parents, testifying in open court about the inception of the shadow charity. The judge ordered severe restitution. Today, the man who once wore a luxury watch to a funeral wakes up before dawn to work a grueling manual labor shift at a commercial lumber yard in a neighboring county. A significant portion of his weekly paycheck is automatically garnished to repay the thousands he drained in Cabo San Lucas. His hands are calloused. His entrepreneurial delusions are shattered. He lifts heavy timber in the freezing rain, paying for a tropical vacation he thought he procured for free. The local forgery charges, however, were merely the opening skirmish. The true devastation arrived from Washington. By establishing a hollow, nonprofit organization to launder a stolen inheritance, Richard and Barbara invited the Internal Revenue Service into their living room. The federal government does not appreciate tax evasion, and they do not negotiate with amateur grifters. The IRS audited a decade of my parents' personal finances, uncovering a labyrinth of undocumented transfers and unrecorded income. The revenue agents levied staggering financial penalties, dismantling their bank accounts with the cold efficiency of a surgical strike. Compounding the severe tax evasion was the catastrophic real estate acquisition. The Environmental Protection Agency finalized the joint and several liability assessment for the toxic industrial parcel Mason purchased using the foundation escrow. The federal remediation bill hovered near $10 million. Because the corporate veil of the Big Sky Heritage Foundation was pierced by documented fraud, the legal liability bypassed the charity and transferred directly to the directors. My parents owed the United States government an unpayable debt. The federal collection process is merciless. The authorities placed liens on every asset my parents possessed. Their retirement portfolios were liquidated. Their savings were drained. The grand luxury home where they plotted their syndicate was seized and auctioned off to satisfy a fraction of the outstanding federal penalties. The velvet sofas, the crystal chandeliers, the imported vehicles, all of it vanished into the bureaucratic machinery. They were left with nothing but a modest, fixed Social Security income protected by basic federal law, but entirely insufficient to maintain any semblance of their former lifestyle. Destitute and facing the harsh reality of their new economic status, they required housing. They could no longer afford private nursing care or a comfortable condominium. They had to rely on state-subsidized assistance. The social workers evaluated their meager income and placed them in the only regional facility with available beds, Whispering Pines Care Center. It was the exact same facility where Aunt Sarah resided. The institution my mother used as a convenient prop to satisfy a tax requirement became her permanent address. Richard and Barbara now spend their days in quiet, sterile hallways smelling of bleach and overcooked vegetables. They eat standardized meals off plastic trays, surrounded by the very people they deemed disposable. My mother, who once threatened to ruin my social standing in a grocery store, now waits in line for her daily medication under the hum of fluorescent lights. They became inmates in the prison they helped finance. I do not visit them. I do not harbor any lingering anger. The ledger is balanced. I now sit on the wraparound porch of Grandpa Harrison's ranch. The Montana evening air is crisp, carrying the scent of pine needles and damp earth. I hold a mug of black coffee, watching the sun dip behind the Bridger Range. In the distance, I can see the new fencing along the creek in the lower pastures. I hired a local crew to replace the rotting posts, fulfilling the promise I made to my grandfather before he died. Emma visits on the weekends. Following her flawless execution of the fraud investigation, Marcus promoted her to a lead auditor position. She drives up the mountain road, leaves her corporate briefcase in the hallway, and helps me catalog the seasonal agricultural yields. We operate the property the way it was meant to be operated, with integrity, hard work, and a meticulous paper trail. I learned a profound lesson auditing the wreckage of my own family. I learned that being the quiet one is never a weakness. Silence only becomes a trap when you stop keeping the truth where someone can find it. When toxic people try to write you out of the story, do not scream. Do not match their hysteria. Do not beg for a seat at a table built on lies. Just keep the receipts. Read the fine print. Let them build their grand illusions and let their own arrogance write their ending. The dust has finally settled over the Montana pastures. As I sit on the wraparound porch of Grandpa Harrison's ranch, holding a mug of black coffee and watching the evening sun dip behind the jagged peaks of the Bridger Range, the profound quiet of this land offers a space for deep reflection. The legal battles are over. The federal liens are filed. The bank accounts are frozen, and the perpetrators of a multi-million-dollar fraud have been relegated to the sterile, linoleum-floored hallways of a state-subsidized care facility. But when I look out over the acres of native prairie grass, I do not just see a recovered inheritance. I see a living, breathing testament to the inescapable consequences of how we raise our children. At its core, the collapse of my family was never truly about a forged trust amendment or a hollow charity. It was a story about parenting. It was a brutal examination of the values we instill in the next generation, the definition of family responsibility, and the long-term cultural legacy we leave behind. In American culture, we frequently romanticize the concept of the self-made dynasty. We place an immense cultural premium on success, outward appearances, and the projection of wealth. But when traditional family structures prioritize the illusion of success over the bedrock of character, the foundation rots from the inside out. Consider my brother Mason. My parents, Richard and Barbara, loved him, but they loved him with a toxic, corrosive kind of devotion. They shielded him from every consequence, absorbed his debts, and applauded his empty ambitions. They raised a golden child, constructing a reality where his charm could override any rule. They believed they were providing him with a privileged life. In truth, they were actively crippling him. By refusing to hold him accountable for his failures, by bailing out his bankruptcies and buying him $15,000 watches he had not earned, they denied him the fundamental human experience of emotional awareness and resilience. When you raise a child without fairness or boundaries, you do not prepare them for the world. You prepare them for a catastrophic collision with reality. Mason's ultimate ruin was not written the day he diverted charity funds to a luxury resort in Cabo San Lucas. His ruin was written decades earlier at our childhood dinner table, the first time my parents allowed him to lie his way out of a mistake without consequence. They taught him that rules were for other people. So when he encountered the unforgiving, immovable architecture of federal environmental law, by purchasing a toxic Superfund site, he possessed no internal compass to navigate the crisis. He simply shattered. Now contrast that with the quiet, methodical path of truth. When I raised my daughter Emma, I operated under a different set of traditional family values. As a single mother working in logistics, I did not have the luxury of shielding her from the realities of hard work. I could not buy her compliance with expensive gifts, nor did I want to. Instead, I focused on honesty. I taught her that integrity is not a performance you put on for the country club. It is the quiet, unglamorous choice you make when nobody is watching. I taught her to respect the fine print. I taught her that emotional awareness means recognizing manipulation and refusing to participate in it. The fact that Emma grew up to become a forensic accountant, a professional seeker of truth who dismantles lies for a living, is not a coincidence. It is the direct harvest of the values planted in her childhood. When my father walked into her firm and attempted to bribe her senior partner to bypass a forged ledger, he thought he was playing the game of American business. He had no idea he was stepping into a trap built by the very principles of fairness and accountability he had discarded decades ago. Our children are the mirrors we eventually have to look into. Emma and I dismantled a criminal syndicate not through vengeance, but through the rigorous application of reality. We held the line because a family structure built on honesty can withstand any storm, while a dynasty built on deceit will collapse under the weight of a single manila folder. True family responsibility is not about covering up the sins of your relatives to protect a last name. It is about protecting the vulnerable, like a dying grandfather or a dementia-stricken aunt, from those who would exploit them. It is about standing in a crowded ballroom entirely alone and refusing to flinch when the architects of a lie demand your silence. The tragedy of Richard and Barbara is profound precisely because it is self-inflicted. They now live as inmates in the Whispering Pines Care Center, the exact facility they used as a cynical prop to satisfy a tax form. They are stripped of their wealth, their home, and their social standing. But their greatest loss is the alienation of their lineage. They spent their lives treating family members as chess pieces, and in the end, they found themselves entirely alone on the board. We must ask ourselves what we are truly handing down to our children. Are we giving them the tools to navigate the world with a clear conscience, or are we handing them the blueprints to their own destruction? Are we teaching them to value the calloused hands of honest labor, or are we teaching them to covet the hollow shine of a stolen watch? If this journey resonated with you, if you have ever had to break a cycle of generational toxicity to protect your own children, or if you simply believe that the truth, no matter how quiet, will always find the light, I invite you to join our community. Follow the channel Aura Vengeance. We share the stories of those who refuse to be erased, those who keep the receipts, and those who understand that the greatest justice is a life lived with unwavering integrity. The wind shifts through the pine trees bordering the lower pastures. The house behind me is quiet, anchored deep in the Montana bedrock. I take a final sip of my coffee as the darkness settles over the valley. We spend our entire lives building the narrative of who we are, carefully curating the chapters we want the world to read. But in the quiet moments, when the guests have gone home and the doors are locked, the truth remains waiting in the shadows. The question is not whether the truth will eventually arrive. The question is simply what it will find when it looks you in the eye.